Alright, so in this lesson we're going to look at the historical perspective behind natural selection. So history, kind of the ideas that led up to the theory of natural selection as proposed by Charles Darwin. So before Darwin, one of the examples of somebody coming up with an idea about how species changed over time came from Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Okay, that's this guy right over here. That's his picture. He used an example that you're seeing down here at the bottom, the giraffe example, and he said that if giraffes all started like this with short necks, and recognized that since they eat leaves off of acacia trees, if they could stretch their necks slightly, they could get a little higher on the tree and get more leaves to eat. And if they continued to stretch, they could get higher still and get more leaves to eat. That eventually the giraffes would stretch their necks and would get more leaves on the tree, and they would pass that stretched neck onto their offspring. And that's what he said, basically, that these physical characteristics that are acquired throughout the course of an organism's lifetime could be passed on to offspring. He also suggested that if you used a structure a lot, it would develop and get stronger, and you would pass on that stronger characteristic onto your offspring, and if you didn't use it, then it would weaken and you would pass on a weakened characteristic to your offspring. Obviously, this didn't stick, so obviously there's something wrong here, okay, with this idea. So this is not a good example. It was a good first attempt, but not a good example. The reason why it's wrong is changes that you make to your body during your lifetime don't get passed on to your offspring, right? Just because, say you had a parent with a tattoo, if Lamarck is right, and that parent got that tattoo before you were born, then you should have been born with the same tattoo, right? And that just doesn't happen. So whatever you do to your body during your lifetime, whether it's plastic surgery, tattoos, body piercings, accidents, all of that stuff, doesn't get passed on to your offspring. But it was an idea. There was also a guy named Charles Lyell, and Lyell was building railroads, and he was building railroads across Europe, and therefore was having to contend with building railroads through mountain ranges. And if you're going to build a railroad through a mountain range, you're going to need to blow a tunnel through that mountain. And so he was doing demolition. He was doing a lot of exploding of rock. And as he was on his work site, he was kind of kicking around and noticed evidence that the earth was much older than the church believed. Okay, so he found fossils, and as he's looking at these fossils, he noticed that there were some sea fossils on the top of a very tall mountain in Italy called Mount Etna, and those sea fossils shouldn't have been there. They shouldn't have been on top of a mountain. And so he suggested that because these sea fossils were in strange places, that possibly the rock containing those fossils must have been on the seabed at one time and migrated up. And so that's what he said. And he said that if the rock was moving and we're not seeing it move, it must be moving very slowly. And if that's the case, then it had to take a lot of time to form all the geologic features that we see on the planet today. And, at this time, the church believed that the planet was 4,000 years old, and Lyell was saying that the planet had to be much older than 4,000 years. This got him excommunicated, by the way. All right, so then along comes Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin's picture is right here. This is what he looked like as a young man. He originally trained for the church, but he studied science at school and was a member of a number of scientific societies. He had read what Lyell said, so because he was an amateur geologist, he'd already read Lyell and he knew what Lyell had to say about the age of the Earth. He decided not to go into the church. Instead, since he was studying science, after he graduated from university, he took a job on the HMS Beagle, which was a cartography ship. So it was a ship that was out to make maps along the coast of South America. And he was also traveling to the Galapagos Islands. and it was a 5-year voyage that he was on. Now, it was the Galapagos Islands that was where Darwin did a great deal of his work. But when he came home from his trip on the Galapagos, he actually studied his collection and evidence over a very long period of time. Okay, so he really just kind of mulled over what he knew. He didn't want to publish his findings right away. Okay, so he kind of was waiting, mulling it over, and he was sharing his information with this guy here. This guy is Thomas Henry Huxley. This is his best friend, and this guy kept trying to convince him to publish his work. However, Huxley, this guy, receives a letter from this guy one day, and this guy is Alfred Russel Wallace. He sent a letter to Huxley stating that he'd come up with this idea for how populations change. And Huxley realizes that this is exactly the same idea that Charles Darwin was coming up with. So this idea of natural selection was come up with independently by two different men, Darwin and Wallace, which kind of lends some credence to it. It seems like this idea of natural selection is a kind of a reasonable conclusion to come to if you look at the evidence. All right, so let's look at the evidence, okay? The evidence that Darwin had. The first piece of evidence, and what you have on your note sheet, is similar structures, which is actually this bullet right here. Homologous and analogous structures. You don't need to know those words, but you do need to know that organisms that are closely related have similar structures. He also noticed different environments produce different adaptations in the same species, and that's what this is saying. You commonly see a picture of Darwin's finches that show the birds that live in different habitats have different beaks to exploit different food sources. So again, just based on what you know about adaptations, environments produce adaptations. He also noticed the work of Thomas Malthus, and Thomas Malthus said that food supplies typically grow at a very, very slow rate, but the populations that have to survive off of the food supply grow at a very fast rate. So this is Thomas Malthus right here. And so Darwin knew then that there had to be competition for resources. And that competition is going to come up again and going to be very important, because competition is what's going to hopefully breed these new adaptations. All right, finally, the last few things have to do with vestigial structures. This is like your tailbone or your appendix. These are structures that appeared to have at one time had a function, but now are greatly reduced in size and function. Darwin also knew about fetal development. So, he knew that over the course of a fetus's development, cats, fish, and humans, for example, all look the same at very, very early stages in their development. And then, of course, Darwin had fossil evidence. So all of this pointed to Wallace and Darwin's idea of natural selection. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at what natural selection actually is. But it's natural selection. Okay, and in the next, like I said, the next lesson we'll look at that. There is a concept, though, that you do need to know. The concept of fitness in an environment. Fitness means if you are fit, you are well adapted to the environment. Okay, so in the next lesson we'll get into kind of the mechanism of natural selection, how it works, and some variations on natural selection.